So how does a nation that was literally born out of freedom end up back in chains? It's a tough question. Today, we're going to dive into a really powerful passage from the prophet Jeremiah that tackles this head-on, looking at a nation's slide from liberation all the way to a ruin they brought on themselves.
Right out of the gate, the passage hits you with a gut punch. Jeremiah asks, is Israel a servant? Is he a homeborn slave? Now, this isn't just some fancy rhetorical question. He's challenging their entire identity. See, a homeborn slave was the lowest of the low, someone born into slavery with zero hope of ever being free. For a nation whose entire origin story was about a miraculous escape from slavery, well, this question was meant to be a shock to the system, to force them to see just how far they'd fallen.
And this is where the tragedy really hits home. Their whole covenant, their relationship with God, was built on that one single event, the Exodus from Egypt. God's very first act for them as a people was to set them free. But Jeremiah is pointing to their current situation, getting pushed around and dominated by other empires and saying, this is the exact opposite of what was supposed to happen. He's arguing this isn't their destiny, it was their choice.
Okay, so if this is a self-inflicted wound, who's actually holding the knife? Well, in verse 15, Jeremiah points to the immediate culprits. He calls them young lions roaring over the land. And he's not talking about actual animals. No, these were the superpowers of their day. To really get the pressure Judah was under, you have to picture the world they were living in. The Assyrian Empire, which was incredibly brutal, had already completely wiped their northern neighbors, the Kingdom of Israel, right off the map. That kind of thing leaves a deep collective trauma. And at the exact same time, you have Egypt making a comeback, not as a friend, but as another predator, just waiting for them to show any sign of weakness.
And Jeremiah gets really specific in verse 16. He names the Egyptian cities of Noth and Tahpanhes. These weren't just random places. They were major centers of Egyptian power. Think their capital city in a huge military base. So when Judah turned to them for help, they weren't finding an ally. Instead, Jeremiah says Egypt would break their crown. It's a powerful image, right? It means their king becomes a puppet, their independence is shattered, the very people they ran to for protection became just another master.
But then, in verse 17, Jeremiah does something really dramatic. After laying out all these external threats, he turns the mirror right back on Judah. He asks this absolutely devastating question. Didn't you bring this on yourselves by forsaking the Lord your God? All of a sudden, this isn't about empires and armies anymore. It's about taking responsibility.
And that one question, that's the key that unlocks the rest of this passage. This whole national disaster was a self-inflicted wound. It wasn't just bad luck. It wasn't about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Nope. This was the bill coming due for the spiritual choices the nation had been making for a long, long time.
In verse 18, he uses this absolutely brilliant metaphor. He asks, what are you doing on the road to Egypt to drink water from the Nile? Or on the road to Assyria to drink from the Euphrates? He's painting this picture of a nation that's desperately thirsty for security. But instead of drinking from the pure spring they have at home, they're running off to drink from these polluted foreign rivers. And, history shows he was spot on. This wasn't a one-time thing. It was a deep-seated pattern of self-destruction. From King Ahaz cutting a deal with Assyria, to the good King Josiah getting himself killed trying to stop Egypt's army. They just kept looking for a political fix to what was really a spiritual problem. And it failed. Every single time. This all leads to his core diagnosis in verse 19, your own evil will discipline you. This is so profound. It's not that God needs to step in and punish them. Jeremiah is saying their sin is the punishment. The consequences are built right into the actions. The entire system is collapsing from the inside out because they've walked away from the very foundation of their society. So now that he's diagnosed the disease, Jeremiah just unleashes this flood of searing metaphors to describe how deep the betrayal goes. He paints a picture of a nation that isn't just a little unfaithful, but is completely and totally out of control. First, in verse 21, he uses the image of a vineyard. God says, I planted you as a choice vine from the very best seed. The potential was perfect. The foundation was pure. But the result? God asks, how did you turn into this corrupt, wild vine? The very nature of the plant had changed into something it was never, ever meant to be. And their attempts to clean up their act are just as misguided. In verse 22, Jeremiah says they can scrub themselves with the strongest soaps they can find, but the stain of their guilt isn't going anywhere. The point is crystal clear. You can't use religious rituals to fix deep moral corruption. The stain is on the inside.
And then the imagery gets even more shocking in verses 23 and 24. He compares the nation to a restless young camel just running around aimlessly, and then to a wild donkey in heat, completely driven by raw, uncontrollable instinct. It's a brutal, raw picture of a nation so shamelessly and frantically chasing after false gods that they can't even hear the calls to come back.
So where does all this frantic chasing lead? Well, it takes us to the final and maybe the most devastating conclusion of the passage. After abandoning their true God for all these idols, what do they get when they finally desperately need help? Absolutely nothing. Just silence.
Verse 27 really captures just how absurd this whole situation is. They are literally turning to a piece of wood and saying, "You are my father," and to a stone, "You gave me birth." They've completely inverted reality. They're giving credit for their very lives to lifeless objects they carved themselves, all while turning their backs on the living God who actually created them.
And this wasn't just a small, fringe problem. Verse 28 makes this staggering claim. You have as many gods as you have towns. This was everywhere. It wasn't just a policy from the king. This was a grassroots movement. We even know this from archaeology. They find these little household idols and altars all over the place. Their unfaithfulness was total.
And so Jeremiah delivers the final crushing blow. It's a question just dripping with irony. He looks at this whole landscape cluttered with idols and basically asks, "So, where are all these gods you made for yourselves? Let's see them get up and save you when the trouble really starts." He knows a crisis is coming, and he's exposing, right here and now, the pathetic weakness of everything they chose to trust instead of God.
So what's the takeaway from all this? Really, it's a timeless story of self-destruction. It's about a people who traded their God-given freedom for the illusion of security from political deals. They swapped a deep relationship for the cheap convenience of man-made gods. And in the end, they found out that both the empires they trusted and the idols they worshipped were completely hollow. It leaves us with a pretty pointed question, doesn't it? When we feel insecure, where do we run? Do we go looking for our own foreign rivers, or do we return to the source we were given?